To us, Elena, to everything we've built together. Daniel Morty's voice carried easily across the linen-draped table, his glass raised high as though the toast itself could seal the future he promised. The candlelight picked out the planes of his face, the cufflinks gleaming at his wrists, the ring she had placed on his finger 4 years ago. He looked every inch the man who belonged at her side, confident, elegant, impossible to read when he didn't want to be. Elena lifted her own glass, her smile flawless, practiced from years of fundraisers and press events. She repeated his words softly to us, but in her chest something flickered. The restaurant had been chosen carefully, as always. Privacy was part of the service. The walls held sepia photographs of forgotten senators and poets, the kind of decor that whispered exclusivity. Around them, quiet conversations hummed like static, punctuated by the clink of silverware against porcelain. This was their sanctuary, or so it had always felt. Elena was used to these moments. They had a rhythm, a private dinner, a reminder of how far they'd come, and Daniel's reassurances that the future only held more triumph. It was the picture-perfect life others envied, the Vasquez Foundation thriving, the newspapers calling her the darling of modern philanthropy, and Daniel, always beside her, always supportive, always impeccable. Her phone buzzed against her clutch, a small intrusion. She almost ignored it. What board member would dare disturb her tonight? The expansion plan had been signed off. The press release was ready for dawn. Nothing was supposed to interfere. But the screen lit with a name she had not seen in months. Gabriel, her cousin, the family's quiet anomaly, a man who preferred code to conversation, the one relative who could both vanish for weeks and appear without warning when something had gone wrong. She swiped to open, get up and go, don't say anything to him. The scallops on her plate blurred. The candlelight seemed harsher, too bright, too hot. She read the words again, but they didn't change. Daniel noticed her pause. Is everything all right? His tone was gentle, his brow drawn just enough to sell concern. Elena forced herself to smile. Board chair, she lied smoothly, nervous about tomorrow's announcement. Daniel relaxed, chuckling as though it was nothing. Let them worry, you've done everything right. Her phone buzzed again. I'm outside, walk out. Now, the use of struck her harder than the warning itself. Gabriel never called her that anymore. It was the name of childhood, of scraped knees and whispered secrets in their grandmother's kitchen. For him to use it now meant danger. She set her napkin down carefully, as though she were any other wife excusing herself politely. Restroom, she murmured. Daniel smiled, rising slightly to pull out her chair. Attentive, perfect, practiced. Elena walked steadily through the restaurant, every step a performance. She did not let her shoulders betray her racing pulse. The hallway narrowed, lined with old photographs of men long dead. She passed the restrooms, the waiter's station, and finally the kitchen doors, slipping out into the night. Cold air hit her face like a slap. A black SUV idled at the curb, headlights dimmed. The back door opened before she reached it. Gabriel's hand appeared steady, insistent. She slid in without a word. The city outside was alive. Horns, steam rising from vents, neon streaking across wet pavement. But inside the SUV it was silent, save for the low hum of the engine and the faint glow of Gabriel's tablet. You read the text, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, her voice was steadier than she expected. Now tell me why. He turned the tablet toward her. A web of names, accounts, and shell companies sprawled across the screen like a constellation of rot. Thin lines traced transfers from one entity to another, looping through places she recognized only from headlines, the Caymans, Gibraltar, Delaware. It started with that odd transaction you asked me to check last month, Gabriel said quietly. The donation routed through a fiscal sponsor you didn't know. You let it go. I didn't. Elena remembered, a six-figure gift that took a detour before reaching its partner charity. She had accepted the apology email, chalking it up to clerical error. Gabriel zoomed in. 18 months, 8.4 million, all siphoned, and the signatory on every release is the same. Daniel Morty, except he doesn't always use that name. Moretti, Rixai, he cycles through identities like coats. The words pressed against her chest, heavy and sharp. You're sure? I wouldn't have dragged you out if I was. Elena turned toward the window, watching the city smear past. The man who had kissed her forehead that morning, who had made her coffee, who had stood at her side in photographs, was suddenly a stranger. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel, she silenced it. What do we do? She asked. We freeze him out, Gabriel said. I'll file injunctions, block transfers, pull his access, but you need to stay calm, pretend nothing's changed. If he knows you know, he'll run. She thought of her parents, who had crossed a border with nothing but hope, who had given her the foundation she had built into an empire. She thought of the donors who trusted her name, the girls in San Antonio who now had books because of her work. She thought of Daniel, smiling across that table as though nothing in the world could fracture. Anger surged past grief. Call Lee Patel, she said, her voice ablade. If Daniel is a con, I want the hunter who knows how to end him. Gabriel nodded. Behind them, in the restaurant, the soufflé Daniel had ordered would already be collapsing in the kitchen, its perfect dome sinking into itself. Elena almost laughed at the metaphor, because tonight their marriage had collapsed too, but tomorrow Daniel would learn that Elena Vasquez was not the easy mark he thought. She was about to become his reckoning. The SUV rolled north along the river, headlights cutting through the mist that clung stubbornly to the dark water. Elena sat back against the leather seat, her hands clenched together in her lap. Every block they passed felt like another step away from the life she thought she had built. Gabriel kept his eyes on the tablet in front of him, fingers sliding with a precision that reminded her of when he used to take apart radios as a boy, laying each piece on the kitchen floor until their grandmother scolded him for making a mess. He had the same focus now, except the mess he was cleaning up could topple empires. They stopped at a warehouse disguised as an auto repair shop, its neon sign flickering between open and ope. Inside, the air smelled faintly of machine oil and coffee left too long on a hot plate. Banks of screens lined the walls, glowing with graphs, financial ledgers, and a world of transactions that looked abstract until Gabriel made them bleed into meaning. Another woman was already there, waiting in the half-lit space, tall, composed, with sharp black boots and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen as many stakeouts as rainstorms. She stepped forward with a file under her arm. Elena, Gabriel said, this is Lee Patel. Lee extended the folder rather than her hand. 5 confirmed victims, she said. Rosa Delgado in Miami, Teresa Nguyen in Houston, 2 small nonprofits gutted in Denver and Portland. And 1 woman in Charlotte who refused to give me her name, only said he'd taken everything she had left. The pages inside were crisp, clinical, profiles of women whose lives had been siphoned dry by the same mechanism that Gabriel had shown her in digital form. Names, photographs, and bank balances that told a single story: trust exploited, money vanished, shame left behind. Lee's voice was steady, professional. He follows the same pattern every time. He targets women with access. Sometimes widows, sometimes executives, sometimes someone like you, someone carrying both wealth and responsibility. He comes in as the rescuer, the man who knows how to navigate bureaucracy. He introduces a streamlined fiscal sponsor, insists on using his contacts for efficiency, and then bleeds funds through shell accounts. Always small cuts, never large enough to draw attention until it's too late. Elena turned the pages slowly, though her stomach churned with each photograph. Rosa Delgado, a widow in her 60s, smiling in front of a scholarship check she believed would honor her husband's memory. Teresa Nguyen, eyes bright with promise, standing in a school she had helped rebuild after a hurricane. Each image was a fragment of a story Daniel had hijacked for profit. How long? Elena asked quietly. 5 years, Lee answered. That's as far back as I can trace without subpoenas. Maybe longer. Elena shut the file, her fingers pressing the cover flat. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She felt herself teetering between despair and something harder, something sharper. Gabriel broke the silence. We'll move fast. Freeze accounts, cut his access. He'll hit a wall before he even knows why. And then what? Elena asked. Do we wait for him to crawl out from under a rock with another name? Lee studied her, eyes narrowing slightly, as if testing whether Elena was ready for the weight of the truth. We don't just stop him, we expose him, but exposure cuts both ways. Once this breaks, the story will carry your name too, not just his. The thought sliced deep. She imagined the headlines: philanthropist duped by husband. The donors who would whisper, the board members who would question her judgment, the journalists who would feast on her humiliation. But behind those fears were the faces in that file, women who had suffered alone, too ashamed to speak. I won't let this become just my story, she said at last. Bring them, the women, I want them with me. I won't stand in front of cameras alone while they vanish into footnotes. Lee tilted her head, a flicker of approval softening her expression. That's rare. Most victims want this buried, not broadcast. I'm not most victims, Elena said. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the servers filled the space, steady and low, as if the machines themselves bore witness. Gabriel finally closed the tablet with a decisive snap. We'll start tonight. I'll draft the injunctions and line up Alvarez. Elena, Lee added, there's another layer. He isn't working alone. There's a disbarred accountant in Miami who keeps reappearing in the paperwork, and someone else, a fixer everyone calls Uncle. He doesn't sign anything. He doesn't leave trails. But people whisper that he makes regulators look the other way. Elena's jaw tightened. Then we find him too. The night stretched on. They worked like conspirators in a bunker, piecing together fragments of evidence until the picture grew clear enough to make Elena's skin crawl. Names she had never heard connected back to accounts Daniel controlled, emails filled with financial jargon masked theft. The life she thought was theirs was built on foundations of lies, and the ground beneath her was no longer steady. By the time the city outside began to pale with the first light of dawn, Elena felt stripped raw. Yet under the exhaustion, a different current began to stir. Fury had replaced shock. Resolve had burned through shame. She stood, pulling her coat around her shoulders, and faced the screens one last time. The glowing map of Daniel's deception looked less like a web now and more like a battlefield. He thinks I'll stay quiet, she said, her voice low but certain. He thinks shame will keep me still, but shame isn't mine to carry, it's his, and I'll make sure the world knows it. Gabriel looked at her, a flicker of pride in his weary eyes. Lee's expression remained unreadable, but Elena could feel the shift. She was no longer just a client or a victim. She was something else now. As she stepped back into the city's cold morning, she pulled in a breath that burned her lungs clean. The life she thought she knew had collapsed in a single night, but in the ruins, something sharper was being forged. She wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. She was a survivor preparing for war. The morning after the warehouse revelations dawned too bright for Elena. Sunlight pierced through the penthouse windows like an interrogation lamp, scattering across marble floors and catching on framed photographs that suddenly felt dishonest. Every picture of her and Daniel at galas, ribbon cuttings, and charity balls looked less like memories and more like evidence of a performance she hadn't known she was part of. Daniel was already gone when she woke. His side of the bed was cold, the faint trace of his cologne lingering in the air. On the counter, he had left a note in his familiar scrawl, breakfast meeting. See you tonight, love you always. The words, once comforting, now read like a script. By mid-morning, Elena found herself in a stark conference room on Varick Street, the kind of rented space with scuffed tables and a single clock ticking too loudly. Gabriel sat hunched over his laptop, lines of code scrolling past as he monitored the account freezes. Across from him, Lee Patel leaned against the wall, boots crossed at the ankles, flipping through a notebook. A fourth figure entered precisely on time, Michael Alvarez, attorney at law. Navy suit, steady eyes, movements practiced to project authority without arrogance. He placed a stack of folders neatly on the table and clasped his hands. Elena, he began, voice measured, I've reviewed the files Gabriel provided and Lee's initial investigation. Your husband isn't just dabbling in fraud, he's operating a network. Layered, deliberate, insulated by professionals who know exactly how to make things look legitimate. He slid the top folder toward her. Inside were flowcharts that mirrored the constellation Gabriel had shown her the night before, but annotated with legal notes and citations. Each line represented not only money moving, but also a potential charge: wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. Every shell company, Alvarez continued, is structured to mimic something lawful. Fiscal sponsorship, donor-advised funds, consulting fees. To a casual board member, it all looks tidy, but each one is a vein siphoning money into an offshore account. That's how $8 million disappears without raising alarms. Elena studied the charts. The neat lines felt sterile compared to the betrayal she carried in her chest. She imagined Daniel's voice explaining these structures to her, the patient way he used to describe them, as if he were teaching her, protecting her. Now she saw that he had been rehearsing lies. Lee pushed off the wall and stepped closer. The disturbing part isn't just the money, it's the partners. He's tied to a disbarred accountant in Miami who still plays middleman for offshore clients. And there's a fixer known only as Uncle. No records, no official role, but whispers say he handles regulators, bribes some, intimidates others, makes problems vanish. That's why Daniel hasn't been caught. He's not operating alone. Elena's throat tightened. She felt the weight of legacy, her parents' sacrifices, the foundation's reputation, the girls in literacy programs who trusted her name. Everything was threatened, not just by Daniel's betrayal, but by an invisible network she couldn't even see the edges of. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Michael leaned forward. "We move on two fronts. First, legal containment. Emergency injunctions to freeze assets. Most are already locked down thanks to Gabriel. I'll file civil suits against the shells and petition for subpoenas to expose their bank trails. We build a paper wall around Daniel until he has nowhere left to turn." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Second, we set a trap. He needs to keep believing you're unaware. If he suspects you know, he'll burn evidence, maybe even flee. But if you play the part, loyal wife, grateful partner, he'll keep talking. And arrogance," Alvarez said, "is the rope he'll hang himself with." The thought of acting warm toward Daniel made Elena's stomach churn, but she nodded. Survival required performance. She had learned long ago that masks could protect as well as deceive. Gabriel finally looked up from his laptop, eyes shadowed from exhaustion. He's already pulling at one account. The freezes worked, it bounced. He'll be frustrated, but not alarmed yet. We have a narrow window before he realizes the whole net is tightening. Lee dropped her notebook onto the table, the pages filled with names, dates, and scribbles of connections. He thinks he's untouchable. Men like him always do. But the bigger the web, the more threads there are to pull, and once enough people pull together, it unravels. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Elena pressed her palms flat against the table. "Bring the others," she said finally. "The women, the nonprofits, whoever he's hurt. I don't want this case to be about me. I want it to be about the patterns." Lee studied her with sharp eyes, then gave a single nod. "That will make the case stronger and harder. Once their faces are attached, this becomes public." "Are you prepared for that?" Elena thought of the headlines again, of her face on the front page next to words like betrayed and deceived. Shame threatened to rise, but she shoved it down. "I'm prepared," she said. Because silence is what he's counting on, and silence is what let him do this for 5 years. Michael gathered his folders. "Then we proceed. I'll file the papers today. He fixed Elena with a steady gaze. "Go home, cook dinner, smile at your husband, and let him believe he still owns the stage. Meanwhile, we'll be recording everything he says." Elena exhaled slowly. She had spent years perfecting her image as the poised philanthropist, the one who steadied the room. Now she would use that skill as armor. By late afternoon, the plan was in motion. Gabriel's servers hummed as injunctions flew through digital pipelines to judges across 3 states. Lee disappeared into a string of phone calls, coaxing old victims to lend their voices. Michael returned to his office to draft the affidavits that would stitch the legal net tighter. Elena walked back into the winter air, coat pulled tight, heart pounding with a new rhythm. The city looked the same, taxis rushing, vendors shouting, people hurrying with heads down, but she felt entirely different. She wasn't just moving through the streets as herself anymore. She was an actor stepping onto a stage where every word, every smile, every glance could decide whether her husband destroyed her or destroyed himself. She paused outside her building, staring up at the penthouse window. Somewhere inside, Daniel's scent lingered, his possessions scattered across rooms they had once shared as equals. Tonight, she would sit across from him at their dinner table and pretend. She would laugh where he expected, admire his supposed brilliance, and encourage his stories, all while the microphones hidden in the vents recorded every word that would one day hang him. Her reflection in the glass door looked older than it had the night before, not weaker, older, steadier, forged in something harsher than love. Elena pushed through the doors and into the lobby, her heels clicking against marble. She had made her choice. The network Daniel thought was invisible was now her battlefield, and she would not stop until she pulled every thread. The morning after the warehouse revelations dawned too bright for Elena. Sunlight pierced through the penthouse windows like an interrogation lamp, scattering across marble floors and catching on framed photographs that suddenly felt dishonest. Every picture of her and Daniel at galas, ribbon cuttings, and charity balls looked less like memories and more like evidence of a performance she hadn't known she was part of. Daniel was already gone when she woke. His side of the bed was cold, the faint trace of his cologne lingering in the air. On the counter, he had left a note in his familiar scrawl, breakfast meeting. See you tonight, love you always. The words, once comforting, now read like a script. By mid-morning, Elena found herself in a stark conference room on Varick Street, the kind of rented space with scuffed tables and a single clock ticking too loudly. Gabriel sat hunched over his laptop, lines of code scrolling past as he monitored the account freezes. Across from him, Lee Patel leaned against the wall, boots crossed at the ankles, flipping through a notebook. A fourth figure entered precisely on time, Michael Alvarez, attorney at law. Navy suit, steady eyes, movements practiced to project authority without arrogance. He placed a stack of folders neatly on the table and clasped his hands. Elena, he began, voice measured, I've reviewed the files Gabriel provided and Lee's initial investigation. Your husband isn't just dabbling in fraud, he's operating a network. Layered, deliberate, insulated by professionals who know exactly how to make things look legitimate. He slid the top folder toward her. Inside were flowcharts that mirrored the constellation Gabriel had shown her the night before, but annotated with legal notes and citations. Each line represented not only money moving, but also a potential charge, wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. Every shell company, Alvarez continued, is structured to mimic something lawful. Fiscal sponsorship, donor-advised funds, consulting fees. To a casual board member, it all looks tidy, but each one is a vein siphoning money into an offshore account. That's how $8 million disappears without raising alarms. Elena studied the charts. The neat lines felt sterile compared to the betrayal she carried in her chest. She imagined Daniel's voice explaining these structures to her, the patient way he used to describe them as if he were teaching her, protecting her. Now she saw that he had been rehearsing lies. Lee pushed off the wall and stepped closer. The disturbing part isn't just the money, it's the partners. He's tied to a disbarred accountant in Miami who still plays middleman for offshore clients. And there's a fixer known only as Uncle. No records, no official role, but whispers say he handles regulators, bribes some, intimidates others, makes problems vanish. That's why Daniel hasn't been caught. He's not operating alone. Elena's throat tightened. She felt the weight of legacy, her parents' sacrifices, the foundation's reputation, the girls in literacy programs who trusted her name. Everything was threatened, not just by Daniel's betrayal, but by an invisible network she couldn't even see the edges of. What happens now? She asked quietly. Michael leaned forward. We move on two fronts. First, legal containment. Emergency injunctions to freeze assets. Most are already locked down thanks to Gabriel. I'll file civil suits against the shells and petition for subpoenas to expose their bank trails. We build a paper wall around Daniel until he has nowhere left to turn. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Second, we set a trap. He needs to keep believing you're unaware. If he suspects you know, he'll burn evidence, maybe even flee. But if you play the part, loyal wife, grateful partner, he'll keep talking. And arrogance, Alvarez said, is the rope he'll hang himself with. The thought of acting warm toward Daniel made Elena's stomach churn, but she nodded. Survival required performance. She had learned long ago that masks could protect as well as deceive. Gabriel finally looked up from his laptop, eyes shadowed from exhaustion. He's already pulling at one account. The freezes worked, it bounced. He'll be frustrated, but not alarmed yet. We have a narrow window before he realizes the whole net is tightening. Lee dropped her notebook onto the table, the pages filled with names, dates, and scribbles of connections. He thinks he's untouchable. Men like him always do. But the bigger the web, the more threads there are to pull, and once enough people pull together, it unravels. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Elena pressed her palms flat against the table. Bring the others, she said finally. The women, the nonprofits, whoever he's hurt. I don't want this case to be about me. I want it to be about the patterns. Lee studied her with sharp eyes, then gave a single nod. That will make the case stronger and harder. Once their faces are attached, this becomes public. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought of the headlines again, of her face on the front page next to words like betrayed and deceived. Shame threatened to rise, but she shoved it down. I'm prepared, she said. Because silence is what he's counting on, and silence is what let him do this for 5 years. Michael gathered his folders. Then we proceed. I'll file the papers today. He fixed Elena with a steady gaze. Go home, cook dinner, smile at your husband, and let him believe he still owns the stage. Meanwhile, we'll be recording everything he says. Elena exhaled slowly. She had spent years perfecting her image as the poised philanthropist, the one who steadied the room. Now she would use that skill as armor. By late afternoon, the plan was in motion. Gabriel's servers hummed as injunctions flew through digital pipelines to judges across 3 states. Lee disappeared into a string of phone calls, coaxing old victims to lend their voices. Michael returned to his office to draft the affidavits that would stitch the legal net tighter. Elena walked back into the winter air, coat pulled tight, heart pounding with a new rhythm. The city looked the same, taxis rushing, vendors shouting, people hurrying with heads down, but she felt entirely different. She wasn't just moving through the streets as herself anymore. She was an actor stepping onto a stage where every word, every smile, every glance could decide whether her husband destroyed her or destroyed himself. She paused outside her building, staring up at the penthouse window. Somewhere inside, Daniel's scent lingered, his possessions scattered across rooms they had once shared as equals. Tonight, she would sit across from him at their dinner table and pretend. She would laugh where he expected, admire his supposed brilliance, and encourage his stories, all while the microphones hidden in the vents recorded every word that would one day hang him. Her reflection in the glass door looked older than it had the night before, not weaker, older, steadier, forged in something harsher than love. Elena pushed through the doors and into the lobby, her heels clicking against marble. She had made her choice. The network Daniel thought was invisible was now her battlefield, and she would not stop until she pulled every thread. The apartment felt different that evening, as though the walls themselves had learned her secret. Elena stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, a Dutch oven simmering on the stove. The familiar aroma of garlic and tomatoes should have brought comfort, but tonight every sound, the bubbling sauce, the rhythmic scrape of the wooden spoon, carried the weight of performance. She had been cooking for hours, not because the recipe demanded it, but because the ritual steadied her. Chopping, searing, stirring, each motion gave her hands something to do while her mind rehearsed the lines of a role she despised. Tonight she was not Elena the betrayed, nor Elena the strategist building her counterattack. Tonight she was Elena the devoted wife. By 7, the table was set with their wedding china, the silver polished to mirror brightness. A bottle of wine rested beside crystal glasses. The playlist Daniel had once made for her, old jazz standards woven with piano pieces, played softly in the background. Every detail was curated for his benefit, a set designed to convince him nothing had changed. She checked the clock again. 7:18. The elevator doors opened, and moments later Daniel's footsteps echoed down the hall. He entered carrying chrysanthemums, the flowers she hated. He always said he loved the way she wrinkled her nose at them, as if even her disdain could be turned into an inside joke. "God, you look beautiful," he said, pressing a kiss to her cheek. He noticed the dress immediately, the deep green one he called her lucky charm. His smile was warm, easy. The mask that had once enchanted her still fit him perfectly. "Hungry?" she asked, careful to keep her voice light. "Starving." They sat. She ladled the stew into bowls, pouring wine with steady hands. He complimented the meal, praised the tenderness of the meat, asked about the expansion plans. She answered smoothly, nodding in all the right places, laughing softly when he made a joke. Above them in the vent hood, a microphone recorded every word. Daniel leaned back in his chair, ankle propped on a knee, posture relaxed in the way of men who believe the world bends to their comfort. He launched into a story about Houston, about how messy the local sponsor had been, about the brilliance of his streamlined solution. "All buttoned up," he said, tapping his temple. "The sponsor roots to a fiscal umbrella. The umbrella disperses to your partner. Everyone claps at the ribbon cutting. Nobody looks at the service fee because they're too busy smiling for the cameras, and if anyone does look, they see a firm name they recognize, auditing the audit." Elena kept her spoon poised midair, nodding with feigned admiration. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the microphone could hear it. "You make it sound easy," she said softly. "For me it is," he replied, lifting his glass. "That's why you have me." The arrogance in his tone, once mistaken for confidence, now revealed itself as rot. He believed he was untouchable. That belief was the noose tightening around his neck. The evening stretched on. They moved from the table to the sofa, wine glasses in hand. Daniel spoke at length about contacts, donors, strategies, his voice full of the casual authority of a man explaining how the world worked to someone who should be grateful for the lesson. Elena nodded, smiled, and let him think she was still spellbound. But behind her calm expression, she was memorizing everything, each boast, each casual mention of firms and sponsors, each detail that would be pieced together later as evidence. At one point, he looked at her too closely, his gaze narrowing. "You're quiet tonight," he observed. "I'm listening," she said simply. It was the truth, though not in the way he thought. Satisfied, he leaned back and closed his eyes, humming along with the music. When he finally drifted asleep on the sofa, cufflinks still fastened, Elena stood over him for a long moment. In the dim light, he looked harmless, handsome, even. The man she had once loved enough to trust with her future, but love had been the disguise. Underneath was only calculation. She pulled a blanket over him, an act of care she no longer felt but performed anyway, then retreated to the bedroom. She didn't change out of the dress. She lay on top of the bedspread, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Every word of his had been captured, time-stamped, preserved. The trap was working. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Lee, got it all. "Strong admissions, sleep if you can." Elena set the phone aside. Sleep would not come, not tonight. She thought of her parents, her mother with tired hands that once stitched dresses late into the night, her father who had driven a delivery truck until his body gave out. They had sacrificed so she could live with dignity, and now that dignity had been gambled away by a man who smiled across dinner tables while stealing from the very causes she had sworn to protect. But she also thought of Rosa Delgado in Miami, of Teresa Nguyen in Houston, of the women whose names she now carried like banners into battle. She thought of the girls reading in San Antonio's new library, unaware that their futures had almost been stolen. She would not let Daniel or the men who worked with him erase those lives. At 3 in the morning, she rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the city. The streets glistened with rain, headlights carving paths through the dark. Somewhere out there, Daniel's network still pulsed, convinced it was hidden, but now she could see it clearly. The Loyal Wife Act had begun, and it would end not with silence but with reckoning. The first call went to Miami. It was just after dawn when Elena dialed the number Lee had given her. She sat at her kitchen table, the green dress from the night before still draped over a chair, Daniel asleep in the bedroom down the hall. Her voice trembled slightly as the line connected, then steadied when a woman answered, Rosa Delgado. Yes, a wary tone clipped. My name is Elena Vasquez. I believe we have something in common. A pause, then a sigh like air leaving a punctured tire. If you're calling about Daniel, you're already too late. No, Elena said firmly. Not too late, not anymore. That conversation stretched for nearly an hour, Rosa's voice cracking as she recounted how her husband's memorial scholarship fund had vanished under Daniel's guidance. She had stayed silent, ashamed, certain no one would believe her. Now, hearing Elena's story, she wept openly. You're the first person who said his name out loud, she whispered. 2 days later, Elena flew to Houston. Teresa Nguyen met her in a small cafe far from downtown. She looked younger than her file photo, but exhaustion shadowed her face. Her nonprofit had collapsed after Daniel siphoned funds through sponsorship adjustments, leaving her reputation in tatters. She had been branded reckless by donors who never saw the theft hidden in the paperwork. You're telling me you're still married to him? Teresa asked in disbelief. For now, Elena replied, until the trap closes. Teresa shook her head. Then you're braver than me. One by one, the others followed. A nonprofit director in Denver, her voice tight with bitterness. A widow in Charlotte who still refused to use her real name but agreed to provide documents. Each woman carried the same wounds: shame, anger, the feeling of being invisible. They gathered in a borrowed conference room in New York, a circle of survivors bound not by choice but by betrayal. Lee and Gabriel set up recorders to capture testimony, Michael Alvarez standing by with affidavits ready. Elena sat at the head of the table, not as a victim, but as a convener. Each of us thought we were alone, she said, her voice carrying steady over the hum of the fluorescent lights. That's how he won. Isolation, silence. Tonight we change that. The women shared their stories. Rosa clutched a photograph of her husband, her hands trembling as she described signing forms Daniel had assured her were routine. Teresa described the humiliation of donors pulling out, convinced she had mismanaged funds. Another woman, her eyes red-rimmed, admitted she had nearly lost her home. With each testimony, Elena felt the room shift. Pain gave way to something heavier, sturdier solidarity. Lee watched carefully, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She had seen coalitions collapse under the weight of trauma, but here, something different was forming. These women weren't just recounting grief. They were building resolve. By the end of the evening, the group had chosen a name: the Phoenix Network. Rosa suggested it, rebirth from ashes. Heads nodded around the table. It wasn't just about themselves anymore. It was about others who might fall prey to men like Daniel if no one spoke out. Michael outlined the next steps. Your testimony strengthens the civil case. The more victims who step forward, the stronger the pattern of fraud becomes. But there's risk. Public exposure means headlines, scrutiny, cross-examination. Are you ready for that? The women exchanged glances. For a moment, the silence was thick. Then Teresa straightened in her chair. He already took everything from me. What more can he do? I'd rather fight than keep living with the shame. One by one, the others nodded. Elena felt pride stir in her chest. For the first time since Gabriel's warning text, she didn't feel alone. She was part of something larger, a chorus of voices no longer willing to be silenced. Outside the conference room, reporters had no idea what was coming. The press still saw Elena as the picture-perfect philanthropist, her marriage untarnished, her reputation intact. But behind closed doors, a movement was forming. The Phoenix Network was more than evidence. It was a weapon. That night, Elena returned home to find Daniel waiting with another bouquet of chrysanthemums, his smile as polished as ever. He kissed her cheek, asked about her day, poured her a glass of wine. She played her part flawlessly, but inside she carried the voices of the women she had met, their stories whispered through her like armor. As Daniel spoke, boasting about future deals and new opportunities, Elena smiled politely. But in her mind, she saw Rose's tears hardening into steel, Teresa's bitterness sharpening into determination, the quiet resolve of every woman who had sat around that table. Daniel believed he still held the stage, but Elena knew differently, because while he built his empire on isolation, she was building an army, and soon the world would know their names. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan was a fortress of stone and history. Its steps had carried the weight of generations of trials, but on this morning it carried something else, the eyes of a city. Reporters crowded the plaza, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Photographers jostled for angles. The story of Elena Vasquez and her husband had escaped the shadows and now burned across every headline. Philanthropist's husband on trial for fraud, romance scam targets charities, from love story to betrayal, the Vasquez case. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Courtrooms are rarely glamorous, but this one felt charged, as though even the walls knew history was being written. Daniel Moretti entered first, flanked by lawyers in tailored suits. He wore confidence like cologne, smiling faintly at the cameras, nodding at the spectators. His navy tie was perfectly knotted, his posture unshaken. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like a man wrongly accused. Elena followed, accompanied by Michael Alvarez and Lee Patel. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied back, no jewelry, no spectacle. She had learned long ago that power was not always in adornment but in restraint. The room fell quiet as she took her seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with clipped words, laid out the case. 8 million siphoned, multiple victims, a web of shell companies designed to mimic legitimate sponsorships. Her voice rose as she pointed to Daniel. This was not a mistake. This was a scheme. A pattern repeated across states, designed to exploit trust and profit from grief. Daniel's defense lawyer countered smoothly. He painted Daniel as a businessman misunderstood, a husband targeted by opportunists, a victim of paranoia. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "this is a story about ambition twisted into accusation. The government wants to punish success." The evidence unfolded piece by piece, emails projected on large screens. Bank statements with highlighted transfers, charts showing the flow of money from donors to shells to offshore accounts. Each document was a thread, and together they wove a net too intricate to ignore. But the heart of the trial was not paper, it was people. Rosa Delgado took the stand first. Her voice shook as she described signing scholarship checks that never reached the students. "He told me my husband would be proud," she said, tears streaking her face, "but he stole from his memory." The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. Next came Teresa Nguyen. Her testimony was sharper, laced with anger. She recounted how Daniel's efficiency had collapsed her nonprofit. "He made me look incompetent," she said bitterly. "I lost my reputation because I trusted him." Other victims followed. Each voice added weight, turning the trial from an abstract fraud case into a gallery of human wreckage. Then came Elena. The courtroom shifted as she walked to the stand. Cameras clicked. Spectators leaned forward. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat with her back straight. Her testimony was measured, steady. She spoke of their marriage, the dinners, the expansions, the small signs she had ignored. She described the night she received Gabriel's text, the warehouse with the screens, the coalition of survivors. And then she revealed the recordings, Daniel's own voice, boasting about shell structures, dismissing oversight, assuring her he was untouchable. The prosecution played excerpts for the jury. Daniel's words filled the room, smug and damning. Nobody looks at the service fee because they're too busy smiling for the cameras. That's why you have me. To keep your hands clean. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The defense tried to shake her. They suggested she was motivated by revenge, that her testimony was colored by marital bitterness. Elena held their gaze calmly. This is not about my marriage, she said. This is about every person who trusted him, every dollar that should have gone to books, scholarships, and homes. He didn't just betray me. He betrayed them. Her words hung in the air like a verdict before the verdict. The cross-examinations dragged on for days. Daniel's lawyers tried to cast doubt on the victims, suggesting mismanagement or carelessness. But each time the Phoenix Network stood strong, their stories overlapping, consistent, undeniable. In the final week, the prosecution revealed the piece de resistance, a ledger pulled from one of Daniel's offshore accounts. It bore his alias, his signature, and a transfer to a shell company linked directly to Uncle, the shadowy fixer. The jury leaned forward, the defense faltered, and Daniel's smirk finally cracked. Closing arguments sealed the narrative. The prosecutor reminded the jury of Rose's tears, Teresa's anger, Elena's composure, the recordings that spoke louder than any witness. This is not the story of a husband misunderstood, she said. This is the story of a predator who used love as a mask. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the room was so silent it felt suspended. Guilty, the foreman read. On multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, identity fraud, and money laundering. Sentencing recommended, decades in federal prison. Restitution ordered, millions to be repaid to victims. Daniel sat motionless, the mask finally shattered. The navy tie, the polished smile, the practiced charm, none of it could protect him now. Elena closed her eyes briefly, a single tear sliding down her cheek, not for him. For herself, for the women who had suffered, for the parents who had raised her to believe in honesty, for all the trust that had been weaponized and finally reclaimed. The trial of Daniel Moretti was over. But the work of the Phoenix Network had only just begun. The gavel had fallen, the verdict had been read, and the cameras outside the courthouse had captured the moment the mask of Daniel Moretti slipped forever. But for Elena Vasquez, the true ending didn't arrive with the jury's word. It began in the quiet that followed. She stood on the courthouse steps that evening, the late sun throwing long shadows across the plaza. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward like spears, but she didn't answer. Not yet. She walked down the steps, past the barricades, past the crowd, and into the waiting car that carried her not home but forward. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's name filled headlines. He became a cautionary tale, dissected in articles and television panels, his arrogance replayed in sound bites and courtroom sketches. But Elena made a deliberate choice. She would not let her life be defined by his betrayal. The Phoenix Network had begun as a circle of survivors. Now it became her life's work. The Foundation's headquarters on the Upper East Side transformed almost overnight. What had once been a pristine office for donor relations became a war room for advocacy. Whiteboards covered with names and timelines now mapped out strategies for change. Legislation for stronger oversight of fiscal sponsors, education programs for widows and nonprofits, partnerships with financial watchdog groups. Rosa Delgado flew in from Miami for the first meeting after the verdict. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied back, and carried the photograph of her late husband in her bag. Teresa Nguyen arrived from Houston with stacks of notes, her bitterness now sharpened into purpose. One by one, the other women joined, not as victims, but as co-founders. They sat around a polished oak table, Elena at the head. The walls around them were covered with photographs of programs the Vasquez Foundation had once funded. Children in classrooms, families in shelters, libraries opening their doors. Those images reminded them all what they were fighting for. Elena spoke first. Daniel built his empire on silence. We'll build ours on voices. This isn't about revenge. It's about protection. about making sure no one else has to feel the shame we carried. The women nodded, some with tears, others with hard eyes. Lee Patel leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, her expression softer than usual. "You've done something rare," she said quietly. "You've turned victims into a movement. That's harder than winning a trial." The Phoenix Network launched within a month. Their website carried stories of survivors, not just Daniel, but others across the country who had been preyed upon by men using charm as a weapon. Helplines buzzed with calls. Volunteers trained in financial literacy began workshops in community centers. Lawyers offered pro bono hours to nonprofits that couldn't afford audits. The movement spread quickly. News outlets that had once covered the scandal now covered the solution. From betrayal to battle cry, one headline read. Another called it the women who refused to stay silent. Elena became the reluctant face of it all. Invitations poured in to speak at universities, to testify before Congress, to appear on television panels. She accepted some, declined others. She knew her power lay not in being everywhere but in being precise. When she did speak, her words were calm, deliberate. At a press conference 6 months after the verdict, she stood before rows of reporters and survivors. Behind her, the Phoenix Network's new logo, a rising bird etched in gold, gleamed against a dark banner. "Justice," she said, "is not a single verdict. It is the work we do every day to make sure trust cannot be stolen so easily again. We are here for the widows, the nonprofits, the dreamers who deserve protection. We are here because betrayal did not end us. It gave us purpose." The applause that followed was not polite. It was thunderous, raw, a wave of affirmation that told her the movement had caught fire. Privately, though, Elena carried the scars. Nights still came when she woke in a sweat, hearing Daniel's voice in her mind, the arrogance of his words echoing. She kept her distance from the penthouse they once shared, leaving it locked, untouched, a monument to the life she had shed. She visited her mother more often, finding comfort in familiar kitchens and the smell of simmering food that carried no deceit. Gabriel returned to his quiet life, though he remained the network's silent guardian, monitoring threats, tracking suspicious accounts, ensuring no one else like Daniel could slip unseen into their orbit. Lee stayed close too, her sharp edges now softened by a sense of belonging she hadn't sought but had found anyway. Elena often thought of the women she had stood with in court. Rosa, who now ran scholarships again in her husband's name. Teresa, who had launched a new nonprofit, stronger and more transparent than the one Daniel had destroyed. Each woman had rebuilt not just her work but her sense of self. They were proof that ashes could, indeed, give birth to flame. On the one-year anniversary of the verdict, the Phoenix Network held its first national summit. Survivors, advocates, and lawmakers filled a grand hall in Washington, D.C. The stage was simple, a podium, a banner, and a row of chairs for the women who had turned betrayal into strength. Elena spoke last. She looked out at the crowd, faces of every age, color, and story, and felt the weight of her parents' sacrifices, the legacy they had handed her, the trust she had nearly lost but had now reclaimed. "Betrayal tried to silence us," she said, her voice steady, carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "But we answered with voices louder than it ever expected. We are not victims, we are guardians. And we will ensure that what happened to us will never happen to anyone else." The room erupted. Survivors rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some weeping openly. For the first time, Elena allowed herself to smile without reserve. Not the practiced smile of galas, not the polite mask for cameras, but a smile rooted in something unshakable. She had lost her marriage, her trust, her illusions, but in the rubble she had found something greater. Justice had not only punished a predator, it had birthed a network, a future, a flame that would not be extinguished. And as Elena stepped down from the podium, the phoenix on the banner seemed to glow brighter, as though it knew it had finally taken flight.